This week's podcast is sponsored by Montclair State University. Located just 12 miles from New York City, Montclair State University is a public research university that's helping students get from where they are now to where they want to be. Nationally ranked for social mobility and Washington Monthly's #1 public institution in New Jersey, Montclair is the state's premier public service institution. Learn more about what makes Montclair a university on the rise at montclair.edu. Hello, and welcome to the Washington Monthly. I'm your host, Ann Kim.
And I'm your co-host, Garrett Epps.
In this bonus episode, what life is like in occupied D.C.
There's a sense of D.C. patriotism that I have never seen before in my decades of off and on living here, of people black and white, rich and very poor, in different wards of the city. The spirit of D.C. is more self-conscious and unified than I have ever seen it before in my life.
Garrett speaks with celebrated journalist, author, and Washington Monthly contributing editor, James Fallows.
Welcome, Jim. We're glad you could join us. As someone ensconced in the Pacific Northwest, I have the impulse to say, like Claude Rains in Casablanca, unoccupied France welcomes you. But I'm delighted to be in touch with someone, broadcasting like out of Radio Free DC, who can talk to us about what's going on. Your Substack post, Summer Afternoon in Washington, D.C., reported the mood in D.C. on Sunday, the 23rd. Occupation has continued for more than a week since then. Update us on what life is like.
So I think life in D.C., where my wife Deb and I have returned after many months on my original home in the West Coast, seeing our family there, it is disorienting in the same way, but a different way as everything else in American life right now. 80% of one's time, 80% of the territory of Washington, D.C., 95% of the time, if you're an older white person like me, you can think everything is fine. There's not many tourists here. The restaurants are uncrowded. You're not being stopped by police. But in certain parts of the city, well, in the monumental part of D.C., you see just an absence of tourists, which is what Deb and I depicted a little more than a week ago in D.C. In the parts of D.C. where there are restaurants and people who, unlike me, are not of, Scottish and German heritage, and people who are doing all the sort of the productive, the various kinds of productive work in this town, you see an atmosphere of real fear and terror. And videos are posted every day of people being snatched off their DoorDash scooters or just, taken out of schools. We haven't anything like a firefighter being sieged, as I know you have in the Pacific Northwest. But it's that bifurcated existence. It's completely normal. Unless you look where it's not normal.
Have you seen any interactions with the occupying forces that gave you pause?
So only incidentally, when Deb and I have been driving around town through parts of town where there either are retail establishments or there's a large Latino in particular population, more Latino than Black, we've caught glimpses of what looked like a suspicious number of, strange vehicles parked there. One time we drove down MacArthur Avenue in Northwest DC and heard somebody yelling out of a store, "Stop, stop, you can't do this. This is unfair." We have not seen a direct confrontation, but the feeling and the pull of it is everywhere. It's also the case, Garrett, you certainly know Massachusetts Avenue in D.C., which goes past a number of embassies, and then past the vice president's house, which I think since the time of Al Gore has been the vice president's official residence. There's a big sign across the street saying, "Honk if you love freedom, honk if you hate MAGA," et cetera, et cetera. And I can tell you from at least last night going down that street, it was a cacophony, as we say in D.C., of just people standing on their horns as they drove past that part of Mass Ave.
Well, I certainly hope it's keeping the vice president up at night.
Certainly his conscience is not.
No, it's not. But we're all comforted to know, by the way, that as he revealed this week, that he's ready to take over any time he's called on. I'm not sure a vice president has ever made that statement before, but um, it's a comfort. I sleep better. Uh,
Maybe Teddy Roosevelt during McKinley's duress, or whoever was Garfield's vice president. Yeah.
yeah, well, that guy had 100 days wait.
Yes.
You know, he felt he was entitled. Thomas C. Marshall, as you know, who was Wilson's vice president, was asked why he didn't become president, and he said, "Why would I do that? This is the greatest job in the world. I don't have to do anything."
In
That's
contrast to
not
John
Vance's
Nance Garner.
approach. Exactly. Whom we will not quote here.
Yes.
So, as you pass these armed soldiers, I mean, uh, do you feel safe? These are armed men with somewhat spotty training for running a city. Do you feel safer than you did, or do you feel safe at all?
So to be, obviously the answer is no, this is crazy, it's performative. The next round of obvious answer is I am a boomer era, well educated white guy. And so when Deb and I, have talked with these National Guard soldiers, they've been polite. And what can I do for you, sir? And let me tell you about my hometown of South Carolina, this or that. Um, I have not seen anything, but I can imagine the difference in reaction, not so much to the National Guard as to ICE and the Secret Service, which has now become sort of more visible than the DC police, and just all the other tools of the law enforcement establishment. I'm going to circle back to a kind of analogy we don't make. What was the name of the movie that came out a year or two ago about the guards at Auschwitz? The family living right next door to the camp. Most of the times, if you don't look, it is perfectly normal. The weather is this idyllic sort of late summer, early fall weather in DC, which one recalls from September of 2001, where the skies are blue, the air is crisp, the weather is balmy in the 70s and 80s. It seems like the most pleasant place on the world, and it can be if you stay out of the places where it is not. And so we have this, again, this bifurcated view. For some people, the same kind of crackdowns we've seen in the rest of the country are going on here. And for the rest of us, if you don't go to that part of the town, you think, well, these National Guard guys they're mulching trees on the National Mall. They're picking up trash. They're raking and not using leaf blowers, I can attest, to keep DC safe and proper. So it is performative. It is horrifying. It is cynical, but it makes no direct impact on me.
Do you have any sense of what the guardsmen's attitude toward the district is? Were they briefed? Were they? I remember, sometimes when conservative marchers would come to D.C., they would hand out briefing sheets about how dangerous the city was. Do you think these guardsmen from South Carolina or whatever really understand the community that they're policing?
The obvious answer is, of course not. They've not been, the ones we talked with have all been from cities, 1/5 the size of DC, small cities in South Carolina or West Virginia or whatever. The next answer up is they seem to be more aware than you would think of the cynical nature of their duty there. We asked them what they were doing, and it's very difficult to explain how bored most of these people look. They would just, cluster in groups of 3 or 4. They, when they were on break, we would see like 100 of them lined up at the hot dog stand, or they are people, they are, I would guess, in their 20s or so, some in their early 30s, and I think one of the people we talked with, of maybe the 24 people we've spoken with, who have been 90% of them men, the rest women, 100% of them white, just because it's an overwhelmingly white force. Not a single one of them said, "Oh, we're here to protect the nation's capital. Oh, we're here doing the president's bidding. Oh, we're here to be extra eyes on." They said, "This is our job," and they looked like teenagers on, high schoolers or a little older on detention, or on playground duty or something. None of them seemed to have their hearts in it. None of them seemed to think this was worth it. I have not yet personally seen one carrying, a military-grade rifle. I've seen some with pistols, but not an actual rifle. So I don't know what that is like. But I got no sense at all. When you see ICE videos, you think these people are itching for action. That is not the sense I got from the people we have met.
Well, speaking of ICE videos, even here in our small town of Eugene, we've had encounters with uh, ICE officers with masks on, knocking unlucky people to the ground and dragging them off. Have you seen any ICE operations that are clearly by the federal or DHS rather than by the military?
I have not seen any of them, in media res, that I've seen the after effects of some. I've seen people outside restaurants where somebody must just have been taken. I've seen, Deb and I 2 days ago saw a huge convoy of what looked like ICE vehicles storming down Massachusetts Avenue. Um, we have heard from friends who live in Kalorama and 14th and U, and not to even mention Southeast and places where there could actually be some usefulness for more eyes on the scene, et cetera. We've heard about just the attitude of fear. We know some people whose ethnically Latino children go to public schools in Northeast DC, about just kind of the atmosphere of concern around those and parents being taken away. I have not seen one of these with my own eyes, and that is because of the part of town I live in.
Okay, I want to call on your unique expertise here, Jim. You uh, actually, believe it or not, even though I said that, it is devoid of irony. Um, you and Deb studied the growth of cities and towns, smaller ones, obviously, but it involves thinking about the effect of uh, various things on communities and why cities prosper and why they don't. Um, Mayor Bowser, I think just yesterday, announced that she's willing to have the Trump occupying forces in town indefinitely, meaning 30 days was what it seemed to be at first, but the troops may be there for months, and the White House will be running public safety with no endpoint. First of all, do you think this is the end of home rule?
So I think that it is. It's a demonstration of the limits of home rule. For those who don't know, back in the 1960s, I think DC acquired many of the attributes of a self-governing place, although not the real ultimate power as has been demonstrated. Any law that passes the DC City Council has the potential to be vetoed by yahoos in the Congress, as they have sometimes exercised their power. I would say two things. One is I think there is even in contrast, perhaps the times when you, Garrett, have been living here, there's a sense of DC patriotism that I have never seen before in my decades of off and on living here, of people black and white, rich and very poor in different wards of the city, from Ward 3 where I live, it's the richest and the whitest, to Ward 8, which is the poorest and blackest, although becoming gentrified. There's a sense that people in DC are being screwed. There are more of us than people in either Wyoming or Vermont. We pay a higher per capita federal income tax than people of any state. And there's been just this humiliating demonstration that we don't have a governor and we don't have any power. And I think that Mayor Bowser, I have thought she's been a basically good mayor, and she must have made the calculation that it's better to go along than to stand up, a la J.B. Pritzker and Gavin Newsom, because Pritzker and Newsom run states, and Mayor Bowser does not. She doesn't even command the National Guard, as Pritzker and Gavin Newsom do. So I think the spirit of DC is more self-conscious and unified than I have ever seen it before in my life. But the sort of flex of DC seems weaker than at any other time in its home rule era.
Let me stretch this out a little bit and say, as you look ahead, now that we've got, the prospect of months or even, a year or two of occupation. What's the long-term effect of that going to be on DC as a city? As you know, I lived there for 12 years. I found it immensely livable and pleasant and fun, with some urban problems, as one does. Um, and obviously, I would like to see the city thrive. Uh, what it, how do you think that this affects that?
So something I think is true. I first moved to DC to work for the Washington Monthly, a magazine you know very well, when in the early 1970s, more than 50 years ago. And in virtually every measurable way, DC is a much better and more livable city than it was 40 or 50 years ago. The main contention is, of course, the racial shift. The DC was majority minority then, majority black then. It was famously Chocolate City. It's become now, it's still plurality black, but close behind is white and Latinos after that. So there are lots of black people, long generations long black people in DC who feel displaced, pushed out of their traditional Northeast and Anacostia residences by people coming in. So there is that tension in DC, which is real. And there is real crime in certain parts of the city. But as a place to live, DC has become vastly more pleasant and accessible and culturally centered and just a wonderful city. It's become a deserving capital city over the decades I have seen. And I think almost anybody who can compare the experience from the 70s to the 2025, the 2020s would think this is one of America's urban rebirth stories with the complications. I think that the major factor for DC is just the attack on so much of the federal workforce, institutional knowledge, solidarity, networks, just every kind of thing which made DC a capital city, of hollowing out the State Department and the Department of Education and the FAA and all the rest. So I think the restaurants in downtown DC are barely populated, partly because of the soldiers, but largely because the last 6 months of just, before that, COVID, which hit disproportionately hard the downtown DC workforce because federal offices were closed even longer than other ones were. COVID dealt a real blow to what had been a burgeoning restaurant and nightlife and all the rest sector in downtown DC. Um, the layoffs and attacks on institutional America that have gone on the last 6 months have hit DC harder than any other city, I would think. And now we have the National Guard. So it is sort of one on top of the other. And so I think if one were a restaurateur in DC, one would be really looking around. I am a longtime homeowner in DC. I have no intention of selling my house in the foreseeable future. It's way more valuable than it was when I bought it, but it's much less valuable than it was 6 months ago, just because of the deflation. Only a certain class of people are attracted to move to DC right now.
This is a segue, but speaking of house prices, have you got or do you know whether there is a move in by private equity to buy up houses now, thinking that they're cheap?
There could be, I don't know. If we had a more ambitious and locally conscious major newspaper, perhaps there'd be more reporting on that.
Yeah. Well,
Referring, of course, to your former home of the Washington Post.
Yes, yes. My former home, the former newspaper. Um, but that was mean. But I want to propose some pieces to the Washington Post on free markets and personal liberties. I don't think they write enough about that. Um, so,
and just to add later for a second, for people outside DC and who are way younger than I am, which is 99% of the population, it's hard to convey the institutional collapse of the Washington Post itself. There was nothing more vital. You would, back in the days when print newspapers were all, you would just hunger to see the daily edition of the Post. And even, I say before the Jeff Bezos era, before 2 or 3 years ago in the Jeff Bezos era, you thought this was in contention with the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, a few others to be the national newspaper. And now it's sort of it's not quite a hospice watch, but it's in that category.
well, I remember when I was there, Don Graham used to say, we want to be the best local newspaper in the world, right? That the ambition to cover the Washington area sometimes took precedence over exposing Richard Nixon or whatever.
And
Communities
to,
all over the country are learning to live without this kind of spark plug. And I would assume that, beyond the fact that you may not know what's going on in real estate or housing or so forth, that's going to be something that retards rebound when and if it comes.
yes, and I'd say a couple things. One is a contrast between the Washington Post, which has recently eliminated its Metro section, which now is part of the front section.
Jesus.
So it's the contrast between the Post and most of the other papers is the other papers are not owned by the second richest person on earth, who
Yes.
presumably could remedy any of these things if he wanted. There has been, and actually Deb and I on our town's website will have in the next day or two, there have been lots of experiments in different economic models in DC as in the rest of the country. And there's a site called the 51st, which is quite good, and lots of sort of local experimental news sites that are coming up, but they can't replace the scale of the accountability journalism that the Post used to do in your era and Don Graham's era. Of course, this is a nationwide problem. Of course, it's the churn of there's no central information source, but to have it happening in the nation's capital is particularly acute. In the nation's capital by a multi-hundred billionaire. Those two things are painful.
Well, on that note, I know that you're busy, and I would just like to open the mic to you for anything you want the world to know about what's going on. I mean, if you want to say, "In the name of God, help Hungary," this is your opportunity. What do you have? What message do you have to those of us in the free world?
So, in the first half of this year, I was in the free world. I was back in California, my original homeland, seeing one of our sons and his family who have just moved to Indonesia. So I know what it is like in that part of the world. The two messages I would have is until recently in my long life, I'd always been able to say about the US, I've seen worse because I lived through 1968, which was arguably the most violent year in American history since the Civil War. Assassinations were the main driving influence. Many of us know directly what it was like to have universities, controlled by police and shut down. I no longer say that. I think this is the most dangerous year for democracy since 1861 or 1863 or 1865. That the threats, because of the servile nature of the GOP legislature and the Supreme Court, has meant that every day brings some new transgression and horror. The follow-up message is the only answer for those of us not Supreme Court justices or Republican legislators is to resist every day in every way we can. Put sand in the gears, make it slower, make everybody else know that we are not alone, that there are more of us than there are them. And that it's, we've seen on the other side the way that protests over abortion policy over the last 50 years, they changed politics. We have seen the influence of certainly the Tea Party movement was built largely on public protests. There's a chance to use those tools for the darker side of American politics. I think for the brighter side, I think people need to find every way, every day they can to represent and stand up. Garrett, does this sound like the Jim you have known for so many years?
I always knew that lurking behind that genial exterior was a mind like a steel trap. So the trap is sprung, and I appreciate it. And before we sign off, I think we're going to leave with on your final note. But I just have to say to my readers, when I first became an internet journalist 15 years ago, as I stumbled into a job at the Atlantic covering the Supreme Court, Jim, you were the person I turned to because I was completely at a loss to understand this new world. And you gave me some advice that I have passed on many times. And if people are watching and thinking about journalism at all, they should consider. You said, you're an internet journalist. Don't write about things on the internet. Write about things in the world. And it is a really vital thing to keep in mind to keep from becoming a clickbait artist, because I think the forces pushing you in that direction are so powerful. So I want to thank you, and I want to pass it along. And I do want to say, in the name of God, help Hungary, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Garrett, thank you. My pleasure. And also, if I can say, I have a Substack site now where I write about things in the real world called Breaking the News on Substack.
Yeah, and I meant to mention, that is the first place I go when anything happens in aviation. When there's I'm quite serious. When there's a disaster or a near miss or a small plane crash, I know that I'm going to get, in the midst of journalism that is really mostly fluff, or like, we can't tell you what went on because we have no clue. You're going to get stuff that is vetted, and it's not going to make claims that it can't back up. So I want to thank you for that too.
So thanks, Garrett. We all have our niches in life. I ended up having this chance to talk with you and the whole audience.
This week's podcast is sponsored by Montclair State University. Located just 12 miles from New York City, Montclair State University is a public research university that's helping students get from where they are now to where they want to be. Nationally ranked for social mobility and Washington Monthly's #1 public institution in New Jersey, Montclair is the state's premier public service institution. Learn more about what makes Montclair a university on the rise at montclair.edu. That's it for this week from the Washington Monthly. I'm Ann Kim, and on behalf of my co-host, Garrett Epps, thank you for listening. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe to our channel or wherever you get your podcasts. Have a wonderful week.